The book that we did a reading group around was this Helen Scott edited The Essential Rosa Luxemburg, which has Reform or Revolution, which we read. Go back one.
Oops.
No worries. So Helen Scott did her own intro, and she talks about, just kind of sets up the book, but this is first published in pieces in 1898 and 1899. Later it was published together as Reform or Revolution, a bunch of these separate essays, all written by Rosa Luxemburg, of course. So what this is it's a kind of an attack on Bernstein, Edward Bernstein, who will explain a little bit about him, but he's in the German Social Democrat Party in the early 1900s, late 1800s. But Rosa Luxemburg talks about how he distorted Marxism, that Bernstein felt he was updating it for a new period in which capitalism offered peace, prosperity, and ever-widening democracy to the working class. After, just an interesting note, after Engels died, he secretly tried to edit out Engels' references to revolutionary action and violence. He was unchallenged until Luxemburg arrived into the German SPD, and who Rosa Luxemburg is the key leader of the revolutionary wing of that party, the SPD. Later formed the Communist Party, but she was murdered by the reformists in 1919. She said that Bernstein was out of touch with the real conditions of workers and that his ideas were a challenge to socialism that needed to be confronted and rejected. She spoke out against him, but was criticized for being young and a woman, as well as she was also Jewish and originally from Poland. So the SPD leadership or establishment was very revisionist, tried to appeal to the middle classes, was cooperating with liberals in their parliament, and was dominated by what they call practical politics. The debates and opposition between revolutionaries and reformists were over the idea of the mass strike, which we'll be presenting on next week, trade unions, the Russian Revolution of 1905, which was more recent at the time that this was written, and the question of militarism and imperialism that later splits the party in 1914 with World War I. Reform or Revolution is a devastating critique of the idea that capitalism can be reformed to provide global peace and prosperity. So now the introduction that Rosa Luxemburg has, she has this good quote: "The struggle for reforms is the means, the social revolution is the aim." And Bernstein was the opposite of that. He wanted to, oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself. But Bernstein tried to make reformism the aim of social democracy and kind of make it the means and the aim. But the final goal of socialism, what he thought of just in a different kind of way. Rosa Luxemburg says, how can one pass as a socialist but declare war on Marxist doctrine? It's imperative for the broad layers of the industrial proletariat and the SPD to counter Bernstein's ideas. The entire strength of the modern labor movement rests on theoretical knowledge, she said. This opportunist theory of the SPD, formulated by Bernstein, is an attempt to ensure predominance to the petty bourgeois elements in the SPD and its direction. The question of reform or revolution that is of this essay is the same as the question of the petty bourgeoisie or the proletarian character of the labor movement. It's in the interest of the proletarian mass of the party to understand the controversy with opportunism, and the workers need to use scientific socialism as a weapon against the reformist opportunists. Next. All right. Part one, the opportunist method. Bernstein rejects that capitalism leads to this general economic collapse. He says that capitalism shows a greater capacity of adaptation in the disappearance of crises resulting from the credit system, the employers' organizations, wider means of communication, and information services. So this belief of adaptation of capital, that capitalism can adapt. The proletariat should not try for political power, but bettering of its condition within the existing order is what he says. The cartels are these employers' organizations. The credit system, trade unions are capitalist means of adaptation. Luxemburg says that the idea of means of adaptation is false, where Bernstein would say that socialist transformation of society is a utopia. She talks about, Rosa Luxemburg, the scientific basis of socialism rests on three results of capitalist development. That is the growing anarchy of capitalist economy, which is leading inevitably to its ruin, the progressive socialization of the process of production, which creates the germs of the future social order, and the increased organization and consciousness of the proletarian class, which constitutes the active factor in the coming revolution. Adaptation of capital. So talking about credit, it constantly pushes production to exceed the limits of the market. It influences the formation of crises. It uses the property of others. It leads to speculation. Puts into this a small number of hands immense productive forces and expropriating a large number of small capitalists. Crises are these periodic collisions of the contradictory forces of the capitalist economy. So that's how she describes it. In cartels, Bernstein claims that these employers' organizations, which she calls the cartels, will put an end to the anarchy of production and do away with crises through their regulation of production. But cartels, as she says, suppress competition by increasing the profit in one branch of industry at the expense of another. In Capital, Marx talks about a theory of crises. Luxemburg outlines this theory, which it's described as like a 10-year cycle, but it's not exactly 10 years. It's just kind of a reoccurring set of crises. But this goes from 1825 until 1908, and Luxemburg just lays out all these different crises that happen each decade. Each crisis is caused by the sudden extension of capitalist economy. In every instance, it's whether they're putting money into building roads, canals, railroads, gas works, whatever it was, this putting a lot of money into those projects just caused a economic crisis in each decade. But Bernstein rejects this crisis theory, even despite, at the time this was written, like a recent crisis in 1907. Luxemburg describes a periodic mowing down of small businesses by bigger ones. I'll get into that, I think, in one of the next slides. Oh, no.
Yeah, so I'll take over here. And I think we're going to see, like, all throughout this that she is kind of attacking these things from like Bernstein's distortions from like every different angle. So she kind of, there are there's some repetition for sure that we'll probably notice. But yeah, Bernstein and a guy, Conrad Schmidt, they theorized that trade unions and social reforms were going to progressively realize socialism. And they hoped that and that would be because those trade movements would be strong enough to exert control over like the process of production, the scale of production, the cost of production. This quote to the right, each technical transformation contradicts his interests. It aggravates his helpless situation by depreciating the value of his labor power and rendering his work more intense, more monotonous, and more difficult. This was a complete failure for Schmidt to realize that like every technological advance within capitalism is really done to extract more surplus value or profit from the worker. And that's been pretty thoroughly theorized and kind of, proven through history. I think ultimately trade unions, they can only regulate capitalist exploitation. They can't really influence the production process. And when we enter into crisis, the union struggle really becomes, exceedingly difficult, and it becomes less effective. So yeah, next slide, please, Cody. So yeah, and then Conrad Schmidt kind of makes some distortions, calling like these reforms, like basically calling these reforms socialism, which I think we see a lot today. I see leftists calling like infrastructure improvement or like social welfare, like forms of socialism, kind of like the working class being represented by the state in some form. And I think this quote down below that Rosa points to about the state, the present state is not society representing the rising working class. It is itself the representative of capitalist society. It is a class state. So therefore, its reform measures are not an application of social control. That is the control of society working freely in its own labor process, which is socialism to an extent. There are forms applied by the class organization of capital to the production of capital. So yeah.
Capitalism and the state. So Rosa Luxemburg talks about these conditions of the gradual realization of socialism. So like gradualism, like slowly that, working within the state will lead to creating a socialism, this idea that she's, saying won't happen. But, that she talks about gradualism as the evolution of the state and society, that the state became capitalist with a bourgeois political victory. Capitalist forces clash with each other through tariff barriers and militarism. So she talks about this quite a bit and talks about that there's like a harmony amongst the bourgeois class up until a certain point when they clash. So tariff barriers, that capitalist entrepreneurs need tariffs to protect their markets. Tariffs raise the cost of production within the country, which impedes industrial development. They are the means for the cartelization of industry. Militarism, war is an indispensable feature of capitalist development. Existing European antagonisms are transported into conflicts in other lands through colonization and imperialism. The means of, she says about militarism, is that the means of struggle for defense of national interests and competition against other national groups. It's a method for placement of financial and industrial capital, and it's an instrument of dominance over laboring population inside of the country. Lastly on here, I have that the state uses social control, coercion, and private property to reinforce bourgeois ideology in capitalist development as well to exploit labor.
Sweet. We got Chels on deck.
Oh no, this is me. Sorry, I forgot.
It's okay.
So I like this quote. This is the last paragraph in that section, and it sums up a bunch of it. The production relations of capitalist society approach more and more the production relations of socialist society. But on the other hand, its political and juridical relations established between capitalist society and a socialist society a steadily rising wall. This wall is not overthrown, but on the contrary, strengthened and consolidated by the development of social reforms in the course of democracy. Only the hammer blow of revolution, that is to say, the conquest of political power by the proletariat, can break down that wall.
Woo.
Thank you, Cody. All right, so this is the section titled The Consequences of Social Reformism and the General Nature of Reformism. This is pretty much her entire thesis, but she states that capitalist reforms are simply insufficient. And again, as we've seen previously, all of the ways that it's broken down. But she states, since the social reforms can only offer an empty promise, the logical consequence of such a program must necessarily be disillusionment. I would argue also that we are kind of at peak disillusionment right now, and this is one of the most glaring ways that Rosa's theories and arguments come through still today. Luke, can you turn me down a little bit? Because I can hear my own voice and it's very distracting. Thank you. He's in the other room. So again, the primary idea here is just that capitalist reforms are insufficient. The key points that are highlighted in this section are in the realms of reaction, utopianism, revisionism. These reforms lead to empty promises, which in turn lead to that disillusionment. And Bernstein's conception, I would argue, is pretty self-defeating. It's promoting the idea that real conquest is impossible for the proletariat from the bottom. There's this sort of short-sightedness and a lack of commitment to struggle. To stop short at reforms as if that is the focus of the stated goal of workers' education, which again feels kind of cynical, honestly. She states that Bernstein's theory begins by declaring that this conquest is impossible. We know that we can use reforms and trade union struggles as part of preparation and as a tool for education and class consciousness. The difference in belief is that these reforms will be the tactic to lead to a socialist society, as was mentioned previously, rather than the belief in actual workers' power to change the state. The reformists, in this case Bernstein, may desire a change, but they have the incorrect means. Oh, this slide just, okay. We need actual empowerment and inspiration and rage brought about by a sweeping rise in class consciousness through struggle. It is the workers that will transform society, not reformists of the bureaucracy. Rosa suggests that as a result of its trade union and parliamentary struggles, the proletariat becomes convinced of the impossibility of accomplishing a fundamental social change through such activity and arrives at the understanding that the conquest of power is unavoidable. The opposite is true in Bernstein's argument. She states that if social reforms are made an end in themselves, then such activity not only does not lead to the final goal of socialism, but moves in a precisely opposite direction. The big difference here is sort of the what versus the how. We can utilize trade union struggles and social reforms and institutions, again, on the way to revolution, as we've talked about before. And therefore, it's a development into that revisionism through reforms. You can go to the next slide. We've talked about the gradual reduction of capitalism. This visits it once again through the parliamentary and electoral practices and trade union struggles once again. There's the reality that within revisionism and party politics that both indeed strive for immediate amelioration of the workers' condition. However, the difference in belief surrounds the idea that these activities, once again, trade unionism and parliamentary activity, will cause the gradual reduction of the core of capitalism, that being exploitation. This means that gradualism piece, once again. Rosa argues that the engagement in trade unionism and parliamentary activity is seen by the party as a means to prepare the proletariat for socialist transformation, a tool for development rather than the answer itself. They see it as kind of reform after reform after reform until poof, capitalism is gone, right? Not going to happen. She states that according to Bernstein, trade union and parliamentary activity gradually reduce capitalist exploitation itself. And that quote states, from the viewpoint of a movement for socialism, the trade union struggle and our parliamentary practice are vastly important insofar as they make socialistic the awareness, the consciousness of the proletariat and help organize it as a class. If this effort is separated from the movement itself and social reforms are made an end in themselves, then such activity not only does not lead to the final goal of socialism, but moves in a precisely opposite direction. Next slide. Perfect. Sorry, there's a lot of text in this one. Apologies. But here we enter the discussion of the contradictions within capitalism, which is a kind of a big one. This idea that through revisionism, which to me is sort of a display of capitalist apologism, that these contradictions will not mature. We know that growing contradictions of the capitalist economy and the realization of these untenable conditions by the working class will inevitably occur. And it therefore rejects the nature of the inevitability of revolution, thus the abandonment of the class viewpoint. There's a belief that these contradictions can be tempered through reforms. She states, it is not true that socialism will arise automatically from the daily struggle of the working class. Socialism will be the consequence of one, the growing contradictions of capitalist economy, and two, the comprehension by the working class of the unavailability of the suppression of these contradictions through a social transformation. Reforms wish to deny the reality of deep contradictions within capitalism. They will only deepen. The machine will plod on. She also states that it is true that capitalism will continue to develop in the direction it takes at present, then its contradictions must necessarily become sharper and more aggravated instead of disappearing, as Bernstein would hope. Rosa deems the characteristics of this theory as both utopian and reactionary and compares this theory to those of vulgar economists. She states that vulgar economy, too, tries to find the antidote against the ills of capitalism in the phenomena of capitalism. Like Bernstein, it believes that it is possible to regulate capitalist economy. It arrives in time at the desire to palliate the contradictions of capitalism, that is, at the belief in the possibility of patching up the sores of capitalism. It ends by subscribing to a program of reaction. It ends up in utopia. Next one. Okay.
Hi. Yeah, love this quote. Greatest conquest of the developing proletarian movement has been the discovery of grounds of support for the realization of socialism in the economic condition of capitalist society. As a result of this discovery, socialism was changed from an ideal dream by humanity for thousands of years to a thing of historic necessity. Shout out to Marx and Engels for their critique of political economy. So yeah, I guess, this is another thing that statistics that Bernstein was trying to use to prove that capitalism was following like more of a redistributive trend. And it was like through showing that, showing the expansion of like shareholding societies and shareholders and the growing number of capitalists within, society in Germany. He uses wildly disparate statistics from different branches of production, some that are already established and, these immense branches of production, and then other ones that are kind of just emerging in new spheres of production that haven't been penetrated by capital. And those where that is happening, accumulation is going to happen because that is just a natural tendency. So he's just really just ignoring what's actually happening, I guess. So yeah, and then she says the economic notion of capitalist no longer signifies an isolated individual. The industrial capitalist of today is a collective person composed of hundreds and even of thousands of individuals. The category capitalist has become socialized within the framework of capitalist society. And yeah, what she's saying is that, and I think a good point to draw from that, or what you can see from that, is that like more capitalists, more shareholders does not equate to less exploitation and misery, of the working class. Those statistics aren't related. So yeah, she's just kind of tearing apart more of his arguments. He denies capitalism's tendency towards crisis, which we've seen before. His adaptations, which we've talked about, he says are going to remedy all these different contradictions. And then he starts to talk about, and then this is where she kind of sees Bernstein calling Marx's law of surplus value an abstraction. And that is probably, that is a central, I guess, theory of Marx's political economy, but his entire critique of political economy is, like I said, what created this kind of, or what's kind of stated before. It's what's created it created the scientific base upon which socialist movements can be built, and show the necessity for extracting the kernel of socialist society from its capitalist shell. And I think the next quote just kind of talks more about Marx's discovery. It's not an invention. It's not an invention. It is a discovery. It does not exist in Marx's head, but in market economy. It has not an imaginary existence, but a real social existence, so real that it can be cut, hammered, weighed, and put in the form of money. The abstract human labor discovered by Marx is, in its developed form, no other than money. That is precisely one of the greatest of Marx's discoveries, while to all bourgeois political economists, from the first of the mercantilist states to the last of the classicists, the essence of money has remained a mystic enigma. Yeah, great chance to implore my comrades to read Capital.
Awesome. So in this section of the pamphlet, Rosa argues against more of Bernstein's reformist proposals for realizing socialism, particularly trade unions and cooperatives, and the use of democracy. Bernstein argues that trade unions can be used to suppress the profits of bosses by the struggle to raise wages, and therefore turn any profits that the boss would make immediately into higher wages. But as we've already discussed through the presentation, trade unions within a capitalist system cannot suppress the law of wages altogether. Workers can only fight for their slightly larger piece of the pie. Additionally, as we see today, increases in productivity and more competition on the labor market lead trade unions to fight an increasingly defensive battle as the reforms of the past are under attack. And Luxemburg likens this to a labor of Sisyphus, the ancient Greek myth about a king who is condemned to constantly push a boulder up a hill only for it to roll back down again once it reaches the top. In the same way that trade unions are supposed to control wages and therefore attack industrialist profits, cooperatives are supposed to control commercial profits. The problem with cooperatives is that they function within the capitalist system and must therefore obey the laws of the market. Ultimately, the workers in these enterprises either have to exploit themselves to the extent that the enterprises ultimately become fully capitalist, or the company goes under. Producers' cooperatives can only really continue to exist when they're backed by consumer cooperatives, but it's obvious that this only represents a fraction of the capitalist economy. Farming cooperatives are fairly common, but cooperatives in industry and construction are non-existent. Cooperatives aren't any more than a decoration on a capitalist economy. In both cases, we see that Bernstein has completely thrown out the struggle against the capitalist mode of production, which is the exploitation of workers. Instead, he wants to combat the symptoms of capitalism on an individual small-scale basis. The natural conclusion of that is not a socialist society, it is returning to a peasant commune. Because Bernstein's thrown out any ideas of combating the material basis of capitalism, even denying that the law of surplus value is any more than an abstraction, the only path left is an idealist one. Instead of fighting to transform society, Bernstein suggests that we simply politely convince the capitalists to be more just and fair in distributing their profits. And that kind of brings the question, like, can this be done through democracy? Only if you believe, as reformists do, that democracy is a system that can transcend class antagonisms and unite a nation, rather than there being that kind of democracy. There's many different kinds of democracy that express different forms of class society. Bourgeois democracy, just like democracy of ancient Greek slave societies, ultimately represents the interests of the ruling, the capitalist class. Capitalism and democracy are not intrinsically linked. We can see from history that capitalism can use absolute monarchies, totalitarian dictatorships, and even theocracies. So while for now, in many of the developed capitalist countries, democracy is considered the ideal method of class rule, this can change. And in fact, Luxemburg argued that liberalism and democracy were becoming increasingly useless for the German ruling class, in large part due to the fear of the growing labor movement. The ruling class would be quick to throw out any democratic concessions they'd previously made if it was necessary to prevent communists from coming to power. Reformists often claim that revolutionary socialists want to ignore democracy, as if bourgeois democracy is the only possible kind. Ultimately, the organized working class are the only ones who can defend genuine democracy, the democracy of the vast majority, a workers' democracy. And just to drive the point home a little bit, cooperatives and trade unions are totally incapable of transforming the capitalist mode of production.
Cool. Taking back over. Yeah, so I guess all these theories of adaptation, all his economic speculation, and his chosen methods of for social transformation lead him to kind of dismissing the conquest for state power by the proletariat. He dismisses it as an empty phrase. Go to the next slide, Cody. And this quote here, this is where Rosa kind of attacks the eclecticism of Bernstein. We have known for a long time that the petty bourgeois reformer finds good and bad sides in everything. He nibbles a bit at all grasses, but the real course of events is little affected by such combination. Historically, legislative reform and revolutionary method function in accordance with influences that are much more profound than the consideration of the advantages or inconveniences of one method or another. So yeah, he kind of selects the good and the bad aspects of capitalism. He says, "Oh, this one good thing is happening under capitalism," and so and incorporates that into kind of this motley kind of opportunist ideology that he uses to really kind of distort a very rigorously developed theory of social transformation. And I thought that was a great critique of his eclecticism. So in the next slide. And this is where I think Rosa just makes some very strong points. The people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. And yeah, I think those quotes speak for themselves. And I think we've kind of highlighted the issues with gradualism and reformism repeatedly, which I think we need to do all the time, and have ways of attacking those things from every angle and being able to make points against reformism the way that she's doing. So, and then this is her kind of formulation of surplus value, which I'm sorry for the big, long, heavy quote, but I just thought this was like such a, just for one paragraph explaining surplus value, I thought this was so beautiful. No law in the world can give to the proletariat the means of production while it remains in the framework of bourgeois society. For not laws, but economic development have torn the means of production from the producer's possession. And neither is the exploitation inside the system of wage labor based on laws. The level of wages is not fixed by legislation, but by economic factors. The phenomenon of capitalist exploitation does not rest on a legal disposition, but on the purely economic fact that labor power plays in this exploitation the role of merchandiser, possessing, among other characteristics, the agreeable quality of producing value, more than the value it consumes in the form of the laborer's means of subsistence. In short, the fundamental relations of the domination of the capitalist class cannot be transformed by means of legislative reforms on the basis of capitalist society, because these relations have not been introduced by bourgeois laws, nor have they received the form of such laws. So yeah, her writing is just so brilliant. I just can't urge everybody strongly enough to read this shit. It's so good. So yeah, I think ultimately, Bernstein's dismissal of the proletarian conquest for state power requires a simultaneous dismissal of the main tenets of revolutionary theory. All these social forms and relations are not juridical. They're not established through laws. These have all kind of been created through economic development. And so, yeah, that's just points the importance of conquest for state power. Just as all roads lead to Rome, so too do we logically arrive at the conclusion that the revisionist proposal to slight the final aims of the socialist movement is really a recommendation to renounce the socialist movement itself. So.
All right. Back to me. We are talking about the phenomena of collapse and the primary tenets of scientific socialism. And this section argues the ways in which Bernstein rejects those core tenets and thus renounces the whole of the socialist movement and socialist theory. Rosa discredits his ideas through evidence of these truths as proposed through Marx's historical materialism, theory of collapse, and the reality of a class society and consequent class struggle. The expropriation of the capitalist class cannot occur without collapse. Expropriation of the capitalists cannot occur without class struggle. Expropriation of capitalists cannot occur with the rejection of Marx's economic doctrine. This is essentially her argument in full here. And we can kind of cruise through this. I know we're going a little bit long. You can go to the next slide. So just like Luke, I also put in some quotes because they're just so insanely brilliant. And this one states that when he directs his keenest arrows against our dialectic system, he is really attacking the specific mode of thought employed by the conscious proletariat in its struggle for liberation. It is an attempt to break the sword that has helped the proletariat to pierce the darkness of its future. It is an attempt to shatter the intellectual arm with the aid of which the proletariat, though materially under the yoke of the bourgeoisie, is yet enabled to triumph over the bourgeoisie. For it is our dialectical system that shows to the working class the transitory nature of this yoke, proving to the workers the inevitability of their victory. I can go to the next slide. Well, you know what? This is basically suggesting that Bernstein is rejecting the entire theory of a class society. You can go to the next slide. Here, Rosa speaks to the reality that within a class society, the class struggle is a natural and unavoidable phenomenon. We know this to be true through the Marxist development of historical materialism. This abandonment by Bernstein is seen as a, quote, reconciliation with bourgeois liberalism. With the nature of reconciliation comes a conflation of the classes, thereby denying class society. In turn, he bases all life and ideas through the lens of the bourgeoisie, denying the character of class struggle and its diametrically opposed aims, and through this denies class society. Rosa states that since the society of reality is made up of classes which have diametrically opposed interests, aspirations, and conceptions, a general human science and social questions, an abstract liberalism, an abstract morality are at present illusions, pure utopia. The science, the democracy, the morality considered by Bernstein as general, human, are merely the dominant science, dominant democracy, and dominant morality, that is, the bourgeois science, bourgeois democracy, bourgeois morality. Here in turn, Bernstein, quote, exchanges the scientific base of the emancipation of the working class for the apologetics of the bourgeoisie, end quote. Basic humans with basic human interests. This is argued to be the evidence that exposes Bernstein's conception of the world as one of a bourgeois nature. When he uses, and this is another quote, when he uses without distinction the term citizen in reference to the bourgeois as well as to the proletariat, intending thereby to refer to man in general, he identifies man in general with the bourgeois and human society with bourgeois society. Next slide. Let me see. I might have just messed up with the slide order. My apologies. So we know that theory requires analysis, discipline, dedication, and patience. When engaging in opportunism to hurriedly reach aims, scientific socialism is disregarded once again. When opportunism occurs, so do capitulations, like militarism, for example. We see this capitulation as characterizations of the capitalist system and therefore not true scientific socialism. I think you can actually go back, yeah. Rosa argues that this practice comes down to a hostility toward theory. She states that it is quite natural for our theory, that is the principles of scientific socialism, impose clearly marked limitations to practical activity, insofar as it concerns the aims of this activity, the means used in attaining these aims, and the method employed in this activity. It is quite natural for people who run after immediate practical results want to free themselves from such limitations and to render their practice independent of our theory. This in turn requires a discarding of already established scientific socialist theory in the pursuit of creating some other distorted theory of its own. Think you can go to the next slide. Nope, go back, please. All right, by pushing opportunism, Bernstein pushes the labor movement into the bourgeois path, which in turn tends to paralyze completely the proletarian class struggle, she says. We've learned before about the nature, well, some of us, of the nature of bourgeois versus proletarian revolutions. And we can see the ways of these bourgeois revolutions, the characteristics of impatience and this sort of anxiety and hurriedness and lack of planning in that discipline that inevitably always leads to reforms and capitulations. And this is what she discusses on the next slide. And this is the last quote that we'll have. I believe. She simply states that bourgeois revolutions rush onwardly, rapidly from success to success. Their stage effects outbid one another. Men and things seem to be set in flaming brilliance. Ecstasy is the prevailing spirit, but they are short-lived. They reach their climax speedily, and that society relapses into a long fit of nervous reaction before it learns how to appropriate the fruits of its period of feverish excitement. Proletarian revolutions criticize themselves constantly interrupt themselves in their own course, come back to what seems to have been accomplished in order to start anew, scorn with cruel thoroughness the half measures, weakness, and meanness of their first attempts, seem to throw down their adversary only to enable him to draw fresh strength from the earth and again to rise up against them in a more gigantic stature, constantly recoil in fear before the undefined monster magnitude of their own objects, until finally that situation is created that renders all retreat impossible and conditions themselves cry out, hic Rhodus, hic salta. Here is the rose, and here we must dance. And that is something that Marx wrote there. And then, yeah, so I read one quote. There's another quote there. Sorry, gotta love the quotes. And that's the end also.